Hello chums, and welcome to Taming a Monster, the series where I take some of Gran Turismo 7's most ridiculous cars to see if I can tweak them so that a talentless pleb like me can handle them without being killed to death. Like any common ruffian, I'm using a bog standard PlayStation 5 controller, and I have all driver assists turned off, except for ABS. Let's see what car is trying to murder me today. Today's monster is a friendly little yogurt pot with a K24-Swap. While I think the K24 is one of the most boring swaps in the entire game, you can't argue with 600 horsepower from a car that's smaller than a Toyota Yaris. As usual, the car has all of the upgrades, including the wide body and the body rigidity increase. However, all of the settings are currently in their default state, except for the transmission, which has already been adjusted to allow this car to get to almost 190 miles per hour. The Jimny has aftermarket wheels one size up from standard. Increasing wheel size can increase agility, but this can come at the expense of stability. None of the aerodynamic options actually provide any downforce, so this car is running 0 for this video. If you're interested in learning more about aero, downforce, or any other aspect of tuning your car, I have a series called Tuning for Beginners which covers everything from suspension to differential to the transmission. I chose the Alsace Village racetrack as the testing ground since there's several sections that can catch out a car that is unstable when braking, something this car is known to suffer from. With four-wheel drive the car launches very well but is terrible in every single other way. Thanks to its long travel suspension, it is one of the messiest cars I've yet tested. Due to the car's frightening oversteer when braking, it can sometimes be used to comedic effect when throwing the car into low-speed corners though. Oh yes, please! In order to reduce body roll and tidy up the handling, I lowered the body height and increased natural frequency and the anti-roll bar stiffness. This should make the car slightly more predictable. The reduction in body roll made a huge difference to the Jimny's overall handling. It felt much more controlled despite being just as prone to the massive lift-off oversteer as it was before. The lack of downforce also does not help. You filthy bitch. Next up, I adjusted the differential. I maxed out initial torque at the front since this usually helps with the typical four-wheel drive braking oversteer. I increased acceleration all around, which typically helps the car pull itself out of corners, and I decreased the braking sensitivity. This should make the brakes feel more effective, since they're not exactly great considering this car was only designed for 100 horsepower. The differential adjustments improved the overall controllability of the yogurt pot. The oversteer when braking was still very much there, however the car was slightly less likely to transition into it quite so quickly. I then increased compression, which usually helps over curbs. I decreased camber, more so at the rear to try and reduce braking oversteer. I added toe out to the rear to reduce power understeer, and I added toe out to the front to reduce oversteer under braking. The final adjustments helped the Jimny for short, smooth tracks like this, and it was mostly tame, so as usual, it was now time for the obligatory Nurburgring Test. The Nordschleife resulted in a lot of crashes, so this was the best setup I could come up with. Increasing the front body height and the initial torque at the rear helped slow the car's reaction times down at high speed, however its lack of downforce meant that it was still extremely unstable in the high speed sections. There's only so much you can do when the car has a wheelbase shorter than an Instagram influencer's attention span. The Suzuki Jimny is an odd little duckling. It's mostly quite terrible to drive on the Nordschleife, thanks to that lack of downforce, yet on short tracks the four-wheel drive traction and the oversteer when braking make it brilliant fun, since you can throw the car into a corner and launch it out with the four-wheel drive and all of that power. Speaking of power, this engine has 600 horsepower, and yet it sounds completely lifeless. Along with the K20C from the FK8 Civic, this has to be one of the worst sounding engines in all of Gran Turismo 7, which makes it even more baffling that Polyphony have developed a sudden raging erection for putting this engine into everything. I get that K-swaps are popular in the real world, but A, this is Gran Turismo and there's an R35 swap for a Lancia Delta, and B, could we not at least have the K20 from the FL5, which sounds orders of magnitude better once upgraded? Like I said in the previous video, the employee at Polyphony responsible for deciding which engine swaps are added in each update is utterly devoid of any imagination or personality. Hell, why not let us put the Audi Quattro 5-cylinder engine into this car? It would be just as awful to drive, but at least it would sound better. Speaking of this Jimny, it's pretty disappointing that the visual customization is so limited. Given that Gran Turismo has such a focus on track driving, the idea that we can't at least fit a rear lip spoiler to this car, when the Toyota Hiace gets a front splitter, rear diffuser and a rear wing for more downforce than a Dodge Viper, seems kind of absurd. There's even a competition in Japan where people specifically take the Suzuki Jimny and kit them out for time attack. Why can't we have that in this game? In the end, the little monster gets a 6 minutes 37, just ahead of the Porsche-swapped Beetle. Since the next car on the list is the 1200 horsepower Volvo that is 6 seconds ahead, the Jimny is firmly in the lead of the mid to low tier cars on this list. So, that was my attempt to tame a rather small monster. I hope my settings helped, or that you enjoyed this video. Join me next time where I'm driving a car that's only supposed to go 88 miles per hour. Thank you very much for watching, and if you're feeling particularly generous, I would greatly appreciate your subscription. Take care of yourself, and ta-ra!